So let's move on to another related topic. In the IQ literature, some say race, some say ethnicity. In the bell curve, you chose the word ethnicity. Now, part 2 of your book, Human Diversity, is dedicated to the refutation of the claim that race is merely a social construct. Mm-hmm. Now, first, can you explain what the difference between race and ethnicity is? And can we even encapsulate all the dark-skinned Americans as being Black? Isn't too vague group?
Race is partly a social construct. It is partly a genetic construct. And the reason in human diversity that I dropped the use of the word race is the same reason that geneticists do. Because the word race now tries to group together everybody with a dark skin who comes from sub-Saharan Africa. And the geneticists know that it's much more complicated than that different people are mixes of different groups. And so they talk about populations. They use the word populations, and they call ancestral populations, okay? And I think that's appropriate. And because here's a second truth that the geneticists know to be correct at this point, which they did not know 30 years ago. And that is, it's not just that you can determine whether someone is Black or white, depending on their genetic makeup. You can determine whether they are Ashkenazi Jew or Sephardi. You can determine whether they are from Northern Italy or Southern Italy. You can, if you have genetic information, make extremely accurate statements about someone's ethnic makeup. That's the reason why you have these commercial companies that I'm sure many Israelis have taken advantage of, which tell you you are 60% Russian Jewish background, you are 30% Southern German background, and so forth and so on. And how do they know that? It's entirely because of genes. So if race were nothing but a social construct, you couldn't do that. That's one point. The second point I'd like to make is that whereas it is true that we are very complicated combinations of different ethnicities, when you do statistical analyses of DNA and you simply tell a statistical program, divide these people into groups based on the way they cluster, and you don't tell anybody anything about their race, just make sense of these statistical patterns, and they fall into the ancestral continents: Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, South Asia, Europe, and the Americas.
This is important. Just a second. Just a second, because this is important, because I think that there is a big argument against what you just said, that you need to supply the software the number of clusters. But you said, okay, even I give the program the number of cluster, it will cluster according to what people say, and say, okay, so if I will cluster to 3 different groups, it will be Black, whites, and yellow. And if I will cluster to more group, I will get eventually I will get the difference between Ireland and Scotland and England.
Right, and it's purely statistical. There is no information given to the program. It just says, look up the patterns. Look, very few people who are watching are statisticians, I imagine. But here's perhaps something that I can illustrate using only a correlation coefficient. Correlation coefficient goes from -1 to +1, and +1 means that 2 populations are exactly the same from low to high. And a correlation of 0.98 is really, really high. Well, if you take a whole lot of genetic variants from Chinese and from Japanese, the correlation between all kinds of traits, not just IQ, but blood pressure and height, and you name it, whatever the trait is, the correlations are about 0.98 or 0.99. In other
Between
words,
Japanese and Chinese?
Between Japanese and Chinese. So they're very, very close. Similarly, if you take blacks from Kenya and blacks from Nigeria, their correlations on traits are about 0.98, 0.99. And similarly for Europeans. Now suppose you take Chinese and Kenyans, and you take the same traits, you look at the correlations. Now the correlations are on the range of about 0.7. Well, 0.7 is still a reasonably high correlation, but it's way different from 0.98. And similarly, the correlations between Asians and Europeans are in about 0.7. So in other words, you have a lot of commonality, but you also have very easily observable statistical differences. And that, by the way, is not a controversial statement in terms of the science. It is,
unless you're Nicholas Wade, who write it in Troublesome Inheritance, and then it is or do. Now, I must tell you a story. By the way, I bought this book as because you recommended with your interview with Stephen Molyneux. You said, listen,
also, yeah,
this is a great book. On this channel, you will see the authors of these books and many more having great conversations with me. Please subscribe, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. See you in the next video.